Brazil's violent caste system. Despite the country's marker as a racial democracy, racism and prejudice still persist in Brazil, often violently and with deadly consequences. This was written by Jesse Damba Diamba, published on October 5th, 2022 for africasaCountry.com. I want to read this story because on my channel I will always speak up for the African diaspora, people in different countries and places, some that I've been to, some that I have not, because the fight against white supremacy includes black people in all spaces and places, and not just only black people but all people, because all people can be and will be victims of white supremacy unless we do something about it. So this is a part of my ongoing series of talking about what it's like to be black abroad. Go check out the videos I made about being black in Serbia, being black in Tunisia, being black in Turkey, being black in Germany, and one about Mauritius coming soon. Growing up, Felipe Adao had to navigate two worlds, one as a Brazilian, the other as an Afro-Brazilian. He studied at private schools, but lived in an underprivileged area of Campinas, a city in the state of Sao Paulo. Both his friends from school and his friends from the street had an influence on his upbringing. Despite attending the best schools and now studying for his PhD in political science at the University of Campinas, Felipe has been pulled over by police many times. When he visits a fancy restaurant or shopping mall, he feels a subtle difference in how he's looked at or spoken to compared to Euro-Brazilian patrons. And for black people growing up as a minority or a visible, obvious minority in white homogenous countries or white adjacent homogenous countries, especially in the Americas or even in parts of Europe, we know what it's like to be a part of the society, integrated, but still at the same time seen as an other, which is a persistent problem facing black people in spaces and places all across the world. I'll continue. It was after college that Felipe realized he felt a sense of double consciousness, a concept introduced by the African American sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois more than 100 years ago to describe the internal tension experienced by non-European people in a racialized society. It was very conflicting to me because being black in a majority of white people, it means that you are invisible in certain ways. People value you or recognize you as a person, obviously, but there's always something lacking, I would say. For anybody unfamiliar with W.E.B. Du Bois and his philosophical concept of double consciousness, it's the contradictory idea of feeling like a part of the society while at the same time outside of the society, and deeper layers to that. For example, me as a black American, I have my identity as an American, but also my identity as a black person. I have the identity of a person who is presumed to be a part of the richest, most successful society in the world, meanwhile a part of a group within that society that is targeted, abused, and oppressed within that society, and navigating that double consciousness. Double consciousness also has other layers of what it means to be human, while at the same time dealing with a world that treats you as less than human, and how those two conflicts create the worldview of the person who takes that, who has to walk through those shoes. And so that's what double consciousness means. It's very interesting. I hate telling people do their research, but I highly suggest people read W.E.B. Du Bois' book, The Souls of Black Folk, to get a deeper understanding of the concept. In January, a Congolese refugee, Moise Mugeni Kabagambe, was beaten to death by three men at a kiosk in Rio de Janeiro's Barra de Tijuca neighborhood for demanding a $200 or no, 200 Brazilian currency, or about $40 he was owed in back pay. His murder unleashed widespread protests in major cities across Brazil. For anybody who wants to say there's no racism in Brazil or there's no racism in any X country, how come, without a doubt, without looking that hard, we can always find instances of black people being mistreated in those countries? We don't have to, it's very hard to find a story about a white person going to Zimbabwe or a white person going to the Congo or Nigeria and getting mistreated due to their race. Meanwhile, in Brazil, the United States, many parts of Europe, many parts of Latin America, many parts in Asia, we hear constant stories about black people being harassed, oppressed, and killed for reasons no other than their skin tone, right? I'll continue reading here. The incident has drawn new attention to the country's long-standing issues in dealing with racism and xenophobia, despite its global image as a multicultural nation. In Brazil, miscegenation became a part of our national identity since the 19th century. For anybody who doesn't know what miscegenation is, it's another word for interracial cohabitation and procreation, basically interracial sex that leads to mixed people, even though there are no different races. Race is not a biological construct that's actually real. I'll continue. In Brazil, miscegenation became a part of our national identity since the 19th century, says Alan Fernando, a history teacher in Sao Paulo. He argues that racial democracy, a term coined by the Brazilian anthropologist Gilberto Freire in the 1930s, has always made it difficult to acknowledge that racism exists in the country. The theory promotes the belief that Brazil has moved past racism and racial discrimination due to the mixing of the Amerindian, African, and European ethnic groups. I've heard this argument before. I lived in Miami for some time, met many Brazilians, and when you ask them about how black Brazilians are treated, most of the time I'm meeting white Brazilians, of course, because those are the ones who have the means and access in the capital to immigrate from their country. They say there's no racism in Brazil because everybody is mixed. But how come when we look at the richest people in Brazil, they are almost exclusively all white? When we look at the parliament of Brazil, they are exclusively all white. And how come Brazil, a country that has had more Africans sent to it as slaves and more people who are descendants of African slaves in it than any other country in the Americas, how come there has never been one black president of Brazil? These are questions that only Brazilians can answer, but us on the outside can make the hypothesis and assume that blacks in Brazil have not been treated well. And Brazil also was the last country to abolish slavery. I didn't read this article ahead of time. I'm just giving you prior knowledge of my understanding of Brazil's history. Brazil is home to the largest African population outside Africa, with more than half of its citizens claiming African ancestry. The former Portuguese colony received half of the 12 million Africans kidnapped and sent to the Americas for chattel enslavement and was the last country in the Americas to abolish the practice in 1888. Following abolition, the government encouraged immigration from Europe throughout the 20th century to whiten the population. So anti-blackness, racism has been embedded in Brazil's historical DNA. If you argue against that, how can you explain the policy of trying to whiten the population by encouraging European immigration? What is that? What is that? What is that other than blatant racism, blatant white supremacy? We normalize brutal racial violence on a daily basis, partly because of our very violent history against black and indigenous people, partly because only very recently, and not so much, we managed to make a little bit more diversity in the media, says Thiago Amparo, a law professor of Fundação Getulio Vargas in Sao Paulo. It's common to see police operations in cities like Rio de Janeiro ending with casualties, many in favelas and unfortunate neighborhoods home to Afro-Brazilians. A December 2021 survey from the Network of Security Observatories showed that the state of Rio de Janeiro has the highest number of Afro-Brazilians killed by security agents, with one person killed by the police every 4 hours. Brazil has the third largest incarcerated population in the world behind China and the US. And I am more than certain if we looked at the demographics of the people held behind bars in Brazil, the majority of them have to be or will be black. Because that is not because, and I have many white supremacists, racists, nationalists, reactionary, crazy people on my channel. Also people who are racist from the countries that I speak about coming into my channel, and they say horrible things about black people, that we are pathologically violent, we are not intelligent, etc., etc. Meanwhile, they promote white supremacist talking points that lead to more rash and insane violence than any black person has ever committed. But I'll say this. Uh, the reason why there are more black people incarcerated in Brazil and in the US and other places is because of the constant oppression and lack of opportunities granted to black people in these spaces and places. And it's much different than any other community because we, as a very visible, obvious minority within a population, are subject to more discrimination because we do not have the opportunity to blend in, to hide, to pass for anything else than what we are. So we must always keep that in mind when we're discussing the differences in treatments and outcomes of black people and minorities in these societies. I'll continue. We come from a country that kills children inside their homes, right? So, of course, we don't live in a racial democracy, says Jessica Rosa, a graduate student and English teacher in Campinas, born to an African father and a European mother. She notices being treated differently when out with one parent over the other. Her mother is generally treated better by Brazilian society than her father. Brazil has a very hierarchical and stratified social structure, which is the legacy of what, for practical purposes, was a caste system, a racial caste system that combines slavery plus the aristocratic social structure that Brazil inherited from Portugal, says Kendall Thomas, a professor and scholar of comparative constitutional law and human rights at Columbia Law School. He asserts that Afro-Brazilians there today are much more likely to be manual laborers, unemployed and living with poverty and violence, while less recognized with opportunities such as university education, secure and healthy housing, and access to capital and economic opportunity. All of this is despite the fact that Brazil never had a legally codified system of racial exclusion like Jim Crow. As I travel abroad, and by the way, I'm making this video in Mauritius, and whenever I go to a country that has a very, very small or very notable black minority, for example, Tunisia, or for example, a very small population such as in Turkey, we are always ghettoized. We are always shucked off to some section of the country or some section of the city that is damn near unlivable. I've always noticed that in the media portrayals of these people who are the black people indigenous to these countries, such as Tunisia, such as Turkey, and other places as well, they project them on media as being dancers and singers or criminals or people who are uneducated or people who only do manual labor. And if they tell historical dramas about those places, they treat them as slaves in the films and that sort of thing, which is one of the few things that black Americans have been able to achieve and overcome in the United States. We've been able to overcome the ghettoization of our people by expanding and being in different places and spaces within the country. We've also taken over our image in the media, making sure that we are portrayed in all facets of ourselves. So you'll see a black doctor on TV the same way you'll see a black criminal, right? Or something of that nature. And in other countries, you just don't have that opportunity, which is why I'm very apprehensive about moving to a country that has a very small black minority, because I cannot deal with the image of turning on TV or looking on books and not seeing myself, right? Not because I'm a black nationalist or a black supremacist or anything like that. Please go watch the video I made about black nationalism. Um, but because I know what that does to the psyche, and I know what that would do to my possible children's psyche, and I also know that those images also reinforce negative stereotypes about black people in those societies. So if I were to live in a country like Brazil or a country like Tunisia or a country with any small notable black minority, such as in North Africa or other parts of the world, in the United States of America, most parts of Latin America, right, I would not get good treatment because of the media that persistently displays black people in those places as bad, if that makes sense. Didn't mean to make that long-winded, but I just wanted to make that clear. Right? And I hope that Afro-Brazilians, by the way, and all other black minorities in different places across the world are able to take control of their image in the media, to advocate for more equal representation in the media. It's a shame that in Brazil and in Tunisia and different places where black people are a notable group of people, that they are not represented in media fairly. If you were to go to Brazilian TV or Brazilian movies, I'm pretty sure the majority of the actors are white or fair-skinned, but do not look like me or other dark-skinned Afro-Brazilians, right? I'll continue. The case of Kabagambe is a signal of the difficult, intense, and conflicting relationship Brazil has with its African heritage and the deep marks chattel enslavement still leaves on daily life there, according to Silvio del Almeida, a lawyer, professor, and president of the Luiz Gama Institute, an NGO dedicated to defense of human rights. Racism is an organizing element of the social ills in Brazil. Racism is an element that is present in the economic inequality and the precariousness of work that was one of the factors present in the assassination of Moise Kabagambe. It's also present in the political violence and in the lack of political representation in Brazil. Despite Brazil's violent caste system, Africans and Afro-Brazilians have always found ways to organize and resist since their arrival in the 16th century, says Tiago Rogero, a journalist and creator of Projeto Coreano, pardon if I'm butchering the Portuguese, a podcast that explores how history explains the Brazil of today. The idea came about after a visit to the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., and hearing an audio version of Nicole Hannah Jones' 1619 Project. A common characteristic of the people of the African diaspora, of the children of that diaspora, is the telling of stories, Rogero says. It's the act of telling stories, it's the act of passing on those stories. Other examples of resistance are the samba schools that are popular throughout Brazil. These communities are a space for Afro-Brazilian freedom where people have the right to dream, to live, and love, said Rogero. Afro-Brazilian protests have also led to the institution of mandatory quotas for Afro-descendants in federal universities. The racial quota policy, which celebrated 10 years in August, has increased access to higher education and reduced inequality. President Jair Bolsonaro, up for re-election in October, is against the policy, calling it mistaken and that it generates coidatism. I don't know if that's a Brazilian word. I'm not familiar with that word in English, but I'll just say that he's against affirmative action, as we call this in the United States. And I'll say this about affirmative action. I haven't given much thought about it because I don't think that the policy has actually been enacted in the United States to a meaningful degree. What people characterize as affirmative action has not actually worked to help black people by any meaningful statistical data. But I will say, if the policy were enacted, if these institutions, such as higher learning institutions, did have quotas to try to make sure that there were an equal representation of people reflecting of the populace that deserve to go to that institution were there, I do not think that's wrong. I do not think that's inherently wrong. If you have 50% of the population being black and only 10% of the student body being black, what does that say about the recruitment process? What does that say about the testing process? What does that say about how people are treated in the lower school system, which we all know is unfair? We all know that black children in these places like Brazil are getting the least amount of education. They're not getting the best opportunities to proceed or advance in their educational studies. So then you're going to punish them for that later when, it's time to be accepted into university. I'm not saying that people who don't have the best grades or people who fail every test deserve to go to the Harvard of Brazil or the Harvard of America. But what I am saying is that we need to make sure that there's equal representation in these higher institutions to guarantee that the student body reflects the actual society, right? And to also make sure that people are getting opportunities to uplift themselves out of poverty, to actually advance, to grow their minds, and to better work in our society. Because we can't continue to have a caste, racialized society where, the only rich people are non-black and everybody else to various degrees suffer, right? This is unsustainable. This is what causes revolutions. This is what causes overthrows of government. This is what causes regime change. And nobody wants that. So how about we actually make meaningful social changes to fix the social problems? I'll continue. Rogero emphasizes how important it is for the children of Brazil to know a more complete version of history, one that doesn't just place them as the descendants of enslaved people. We will keep fighting so that black children can be anything they want to be and that their lives don't have to be interrupted, as is unfortunately the case in Brazil. And that's the end of the article. Jesse Diamba is a freelance journalist covering race and international issues. Bravo on the writing. Great article here. So yeah, once again, we see that white supremacy and anti-blackness exists all over the planet. Brazil has been studied by many other better YouTubers than me about the racism that exists there and by many other scholars and academics. I'm just giving my voice and my opinion here, which is what I do on my channel. So thank you for watching. My name is Simon Hill. Hit the like button, subscribe, leave a comment, and peace.